Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our ship comparison series. This time we're going to compare the Iowa Class Battleships, like New Jersey, to the British King George V class. Now, I could have sworn that we had filmed this video already, but I can't seem to find it uploaded anywhere, so we're going to talk about these ships that we probably should have talked about long before now. Now, you've probably already seen our videos on the Nelson class battleships, the Lion class battleships, and the Vanguard, which the Nelsons came before the King Georges, and the Lion was projected to come after, and Vanguard did come after the King George V. And I could have sworn we had a King George V there in the midst, but anyway, here we are. So, King George V class battleships were a class of 5 Washington Naval Treaty era battleships. So they were designed to displace 35,000 tons. The 5 ships were King George V herself, which if you're talking about her in the comments, just call her KGV, Prince of Wales, POW, Duke of York, DOY, and Anson and Howe, which their names are short enough they don't need to be turned into an acronym. These 5 ships were pretty much Great Britain's only modern battleships during World War II. The nail rods were already 20 years old by the beginning of the war. Not quite that, but they were pretty old by the beginning of the war, and they were extremely slow, well-designed though they may have been. The older battleships had all seen service in World War I. The R class and the Queen Elizabeth class, as had the renowned battle cruisers. And then they had HMS Hood, which just barely predated the nail rods. So those 15 battleships were the cream of the Royal Navy. So going into the 1930s, the Royal Navy knew they needed to design a new modern type of battleship. But they still hadn't fully economically recovered from World War I, so they couldn't just build them willy-nilly like they had been in the early 1900s. So they started looking at plans for these ships in the late 20s, planning to lay them down in 1931. However, following the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, there was the London Naval Treaty in 1930, and the signatory powers all agreed to delay battleship construction for another couple years. So, all those plans got shelved, and then about 1935, when the first London Naval Treaty was going to expire, they pulled those plans off the shelves again and met in London for a second London Naval Treaty. This new treaty agreed to maintain the displacement of 35,000 tons, even though Great Britain had been trying to get the displacement lowered even lower than that. And they agreed to lower the size of main battery guns from 16 inches down to 14 inches. The problem is, Japan never ratified the treaty, and there was a clause that if Japan didn't ratify this treaty by a certain date, that then the 14-inch clause gets null and void. So, the United States and Great Britain are the two countries primarily affected by this, and they both need to lay down some new battleships to replace their old ones, and they don't want to wait until the mid-1940s to get them, so they need to lay them down pretty quickly. And gun barrels are one of those long lead items, so even though it's relatively simple at the design stage to swap out one size gun for another, it's not simple at all, but comparatively simple, that still means you've got to then make those new guns, which takes a couple of years, which will delay your whole construction program while you wait for them. So one of the first things you order when a new ship is authorized is the gun barrels for them, so that those are ready to go by the time that you're actually building the ship. So this is where the King Georges get into trouble. And the King Georges are contemporaries of the American North Carolina class. You'll remember from our video on North Carolina that North Carolina was originally designed to the Second London Naval Treaty with 12 14-inch guns in 3 quadruple turrets. When that treaty wasn't ratified, they swapped out the triple 14-inch turrets, quadruple 14-inch turrets with triple 16-inch turrets that had the same footprint. Relatively simple fix there, and meant that our battleships weren't going to be outgunned by anybody else, in theory. However, it meant that those ships did not have an appropriate level of armor plating for the size of guns they carry. Typically, if you're building a battleship with 16-inch guns, you want it armored against 16-inch guns because that's what your enemy is building. If it's got 14-inch guns, you're armored against 14-inch guns, and so on and so forth. So, North Carolina, they didn't upgrade the armor at all. They did upgrade the gun size. But then, instead of building multiple North Carolina class ships, they only built the 2 that had been authorized, and they completely went back to the drawing board for their next 35,000-ton battleships, the South Dakota class, which then had the 16-inch gun included from day one and had a whole redesigned armor scheme. The Americans had the luxury of delaying completion of North Carolina by a year or two, by virtue of being separated from our enemies by several oceans. And the United States was able to stay out of World War II for an extra year or two longer than anyone else. So by 1942, when North Carolina finally makes it into the Pacific, the United States is just then entering the war. Great Britain didn't have that luxury. They're in Europe, they're in the thick of it, so the conscious decision was made that they were going to go forward with their 14-inch gun battleship design, regardless. So they had to start that process in 1936 so that they would know that they would have these ships done by late 1940. Delaying might have delayed these ships' entry into the war until 1942, which would have been 3 years into the war for Great Britain, which meant they would have had to fight the war for 3 years with nothing but World War I leftover designs. So they really made a smart, calculated decision in launching these ships right away. It did mean that the King George V class had the weakest main battery of any of the post-Washington Naval Treaty battleships. The European battleships, with the exception of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, all had 15-inch turrets. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were built with 11-inch turrets as an expedience and were supposed to be regunned with 15-inch turrets later on. Just so happened that that never transpired. But very similar process there. We have the 11-inch gun now. The 15-inch gun will be a couple years longer. Let's just build these ships now and deal with the new guns later. The British started the King George V process before the Washington Naval Treaty, before the Second London Naval Treaty had been ratified. So they were initially looking at 3 triple 15-inch turrets. And that would have been pretty comparable with what other European countries were making. The Italian Littorios with 15-inch guns, the German Bismarcks with 15-inch guns, the French Richelieus with 15-inch guns. And they would have been able to hold their own against the 16-inch armed American battleships and what everybody thought at the time was 16-inch armed Japanese battleships. The British had an excellent 15-inch gun design on hand. It was a World War I holdover that needed some work, but it could have been quick to implement. But with the London Naval Treaty, they decided to go with the 14-inch guns. So they were going to do 12 guns, just like the North Carolinas, in 3 quadruple turrets. Well, that was going to be too heavy. They couldn't cut the weight down to 35,000 tons. So they decided to use the superimposed turret forward. They converted to a twin turret instead of a quadruple turret. This saved top weight, made the ships more stable. They are designed to operate in the North Atlantic, which is much rougher weather than other places. This also shaved a couple hundred tons so that they were able to do the other things they wanted to do. So let's look at the final design for these ships. They were designed to be 35,000 tons standard. They ended up being about 42,000 tons full load, which is pretty comparable to the French Richelieu, the American North Carolina or South Dakotas, the other treaty-built ships. They were 745 feet long, which is about 140 feet shorter than this vessel. They were 103 feet wide, which is 5 feet narrower than this vessel. And they only drew 33.5 feet of water fully loaded, which is about 5 feet less than this vessel. So all around, it is a smaller ship, smaller weight, smaller size. Less material investment, which is why Great Britain was able to turn out 5 of these over the course of a couple of years. For propulsion, she made 110,000 horsepower, which could get the ship up to about 28 knots, which again is pretty comparable with other treaty-era battleships. They all tend to fall between 27 and 30 knots, with the exception of the older Nell rods, which were built before the high speed became as imperative. They used 700-degree steam, which got them 400 pounds of pressure and 230 revolutions on the shafts. The Iowas have 600-pound steam at 850 degrees and 202 revolutions on the shaft. So a little bit different there. At 10 knots, they could make 15,600 nautical miles, which is an extremely good range. The Iowas themselves could make 15,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. So the King Georges are right there in the same ballpark. Obviously, as you go faster, you lose a lot of that economy. But the fact that these ships could redeploy halfway around the world on one tank of gas was a huge boon for Great Britain, which had colonies and interests all over the world. And you did see these ships operating in the Atlantic and Mediterranean and in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They had a crew of about 1,422 guys. In addition to the 10 14-inch guns, they had 16 5.25-inch guns as their dual-purpose secondary. They had as many as 64 octuple 2-pounders. Not all those mountings were necessarily octuple, but the bulk of them were 8-barreled 2-pounder guns. These were a pretty good anti-aircraft gun as designed. Sure focuses a lot of firepower on one aircraft, but when you're being swarmed by aircraft, having a smaller number of mounts with more barrels means that you can engage fewer targets. By the end of the war, the surviving ships also had 10 Bofors 40mm guns added and as many as 36 20mm guns. Earlier in the war, King George V and Prince of Wales at least had unrotated projectile mounts, which was an idea of you basically shoot up balloons with steel cables on them from fixed positions on the forward and aft part of the ship, and then that will interfere with dive bombers trying to dive on your ship. Interesting idea, didn't really work in practice, got replaced with real guns later on. Let's see. The 5.25-inch gun, I've probably talked about in some of the other British ship videos, was a pretty decent gun against surface targets. It had a longer range and a better, a heavier projectile if you're shooting at an enemy surface ship. However, it was a heavier mount than the American 5-inch 38, and it had a much, much lower rate of fire, again because of the heavier weight of the projectile. The 5-inch 38 fired a 55-pound projectile that could be pretty rapidly manually loaded, about 1 round every 4 seconds, about 15 rounds a minute. The British rounds were as much as 90 pounds, and you could only load 8 or 9 of them a minute, even though on paper you were supposed to get a much higher rate of fire. It was just a heavy round to be manually loading quickly. And the gun mount itself wasn't as quick to train and elevate as its American counterpart. And then, again, to save weight, there were only 8 twin mounts, whereas most of the American battleships of the same time had 10 twin mounts. So when you're comparing this vessel to an Iowa, that gunnery doesn't compare favorably. When you're comparing it, though, to other European warships and even Japanese warships, it does compare pretty favorably with the anti-aircraft guns. Most European countries are still using a mixed secondary battery, with some that are good for surface vessels and some that are good for aircraft. So the fact that the British are using a dual purpose to save weight is really good. And again, the British are putting less resources into these 35,000 ton ships than the Italians are putting into their 40-something thousand ton Littorios, or the Germans are putting into their 50-something thousand ton Bismarcks, or the Japanese are putting into their 70-something thousand ton Yamatos. And so the British are able to churn out 5 of these at the beginning of the war and really bolster their fleet by an extra 30%, while other countries churn out 2 or 3 ships during the same time period. So, engineering, they're middle of the park. Gunnery, they're middle of the field. Armor plating is where these ships excel. They had a 14.7-inch armored belt at its thickest, and this belt covered an area 23.5 feet high, including 15 feet below the waterline. Tests that the British did during the interwar period showed that many shell hits could be attained from plunging fire, hitting the water in front of your ship, and then continuing underwater into your ship. And sure enough, Bismarck scored hits on Prince of Wales under the waterline like this, and the Japanese invested a huge amount of resources in developing projectiles that would maintain their trajectory underwater. And so the British had a good armor scheme for this, and by extending the belt below the waterline, that also helped with their torpedo protection. The main armored deck was 5.88 inches thick over the magazines, which is just a little bit less than the Iowas with 6-inch armored decks. But that's not telling the whole story. The main deck was 1.25 inches of ductile steel, or Ducel, I'm not quite sure how, D-U-C-E-L, or A-L. I'm terrible at spelling. Read it a lot, never heard it said out loud. British steel for their armor was possibly the best in the world at the time, and is used in a pretty comparable way to the Iowas. 1.25 inch main deck, where the Iowas have 1.5 inches of STS steel, 5.88 inches over the magazines, where the Iowas have 6 inches. On the British ships, it is about 1 inch thinner over the engineering plant, and the Iowas don't thin out like that. And then there was 1.5 inches splinter deck under that. So it comes out to about 9.13 inches in total thickness. So in some ways, the King George V's have better deck armor than the Iowas. And their belt armor, again, 14.7 inches. The Iowas are 12.1 inches thick. So on paper, their belt covers a broader area and is thicker. The Iowas use an angled internal belt, so a shell has to pass through the shell plating and some other layers before it gets to the belt, and then because of the angle, it's got a greater equivalent thickness than it actually is. The King George V's go with a exterior belt that's pure vertical. On the Iowas, that 12-inch thickness is only 10.5 feet deep, and it pretty much ends at the waterline where it starts to step down to 11 inches, and then it tapers even lower, and eventually is only about 1 inch thick at the very, very bottom of the ship. Again, the King George V's have a 23.5 foot high belt that goes 15 feet below the waterline. The turret faceplates are much lighter, only 12.75 inches, whereas the Iowas have 17 inches. The King George V's have some of the lightest turret armor of any contemporary battleships, and their conning tower has a maximum thickness of only 4 inches. The British were already looking at removing the armored conning tower because during World War I they found that their officers didn't command from the protection of the armored conning tower. They were good English gentlemen, and they commanded from exposed positions where they could actually see the battlefield around them, and where they could put themselves in harm's way in a gentlemanly fashion. So the British saved weight high in their superstructures by eliminating that and giving them basically splinter protection. And other countries were looking at that at the end of World War II, and future U.S. Navy battleships may well have lost their armored conning towers. It still shows up in the designs for the later Iowas and the Montana class, but the rebuilt Pearl Harbor era battleships also only got 4 or 5 inch armor protection to their superstructures. So the U.S. Navy had started to make a switch over and may well have continued that into new battleship construction, had any more been built. The British are maybe ahead of the curve on this. Let's see. So, on paper, the 14-inch guns could possibly penetrate the Iowa class armor at most ranges. The 16-inch guns of an Iowa could possibly penetrate the British armor at most ranges. The British have better armor. They're one of the few ships in history that are armored for a caliber greater than their own main battery. Even though they decided to go with the 14-inch gun, they knew that other countries had 15 and 16-inch armed battleships out there at the time, and so they protected their ships against what was out there instead of what their own ships were armed with. And that was a really good call on their part. They also featured a Liar torpedo defense system that was very different from their older ships. Ships like Hood had crushing tubes on the inside, which was a very complex system that was hard to replace. And these ships had something more similar to the American system, where you just have a layer of liquid and void loaded spaces that's several feet deep that a torpedo would have to blow through several succeeding bulkheads to get to the inside of the ship. And their torpedo protection was rated for a 1,000-pound warhead, which was pretty good. Now, all that being said, how did these 5 ships do in combat? They all entered service between 1940 and 1942, and so they saw a lot of service during World War II. In fact, 3 of these battleships fought enemy battleships. One, Prince of Wales, was sunk December 10th, 1941, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She was the only member of the class sunk. She was the first treaty battleship to enter the Pacific Ocean, and she was basically operating without air cover while the Japanese were doing a lot of their early war invasions right after Pearl Harbor, and she was spotted from the air as she and the World War I era battlecruiser Repulse and a couple of destroyers were trying to find Japanese troop convoys. And so the Japanese rediverted their convoys in different directions and sent land-based aircraft to attack them, primarily with torpedoes, although there was at least one bomb hit on Prince of Wales. And Prince of Wales took a number of torpedo hits. At the time, they believed it was 6. Subsequent surveys of the wreck have only found 4 hits. 1 on the actual torpedo protection, which does not seem like it penetrated the inner holding bulkhead. So it looks like their torpedo protection held up even against vaunted Japanese torpedoes. However, 3 of the hits did hit outside of the torpedo defensive bulkhead, so that would be on the forward part of the ship or the aft part of the ship. And that caused enough progressive flooding that the ship lost speed and lost buoyancy and eventually rolled over. The thing that really did her in was a fluke hit, much like the torpedo that had hit Bismarck earlier. A torpedo hit the propeller shaft for her B propeller, which I believe is it's the outboard shaft, I believe, on the port side. And it hit in such a way that the mounting bracket that held it to the hull on the outside of the ship was completely sheared off. This all happened so quick that they didn't have time to shut down the engine. So the engine is still spinning. The propeller shaft, which is no longer held in place, so instead of spinning in a tight little circle, it starts to pinwheel. And so that opened up several bulkheads and gland seals passing through the outside of the hull and then going all the way down the shaft alleys and back to the B engine room. And that caused progressive flooding that damage control was not able to fix, which eventually led to the loss of the vessel. The ship was in a no-win situation. The first torpedo that hit her knocked her speed down and essentially mission killed the vessel. And at that point, the Japanese could just throw torpedo planes at her all day long, and she was going to sink. Prince of Wales had the shortest service life of any British battleship ever. She was rushed into service in May of 1941, specifically to hunt for the Bismarck, and she was rushed into service so far ahead of schedule that her crew wasn't fully trained, and she still had yard workers on board when the ship sortied. She and Hood engaged Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, and when Hood was sunk, Prince of Wales essentially fought Bismarck and Prince Eugen by herself and managed to score at least 2 hits on Bismarck, which mission killed that ship and caused her to lose enough speed that she would abort her mission and head back to France and eventually be caught and sunk. Prince of Wales, in return, took some fire, including 1 hit that killed everyone on the bridge killed or incapacitated everyone on the bridge except Captain Leach himself. So maybe that shows that the ship did need an armored conning tower. Otherwise, the ship had a relatively poor showing in that only 74% of the ordered shots that the ship was supposed to take actually fired. There were a number of issues with the gun jamming, and some of this can be attributed to the ship being new and still working up. The crew wasn't fully trained. The ship hadn't done real gunnery trials yet, so that they hadn't done final modifications on the weapon system. But part of it was the 14-inch gun system, particularly the quadruple turrets, were really complicated. And even on the ships that did get the chance to work up, there were severe failures. But again, 74% of failures. Bismarck herself had 74% successful, 26% failures. Bismarck herself only had 89% successes, and that was a ship that had gone through trials and done significant training before the battle. So you're never going to have 100% of the guns you load being able to fire. Different things happen so that it takes too long to load the guns, so that when the salvo is fired, some of the barrels just aren't finished yet. Mechanical failures happen, the gun turrets jam, different things happen. It happened on this ship, the New Jersey, in combat, as you can see it happen on Bismarck, but it seemed to happen at a much higher percent on the British ships with their quadruple 14-inch guns. So, for example, King George V, which entered the war in December 1940, and then participated in the chase for the Bismarck as well, and was there along with Nelson to shell Bismarck into submission in May of 1941. Excuse me, not Nelson, Rodney. King George V and Rodney shelled Bismarck into submission in May of 41. By the end of the battle, half of King George V's 10 guns had jammed and were no longer operable. So she was only able to fire 5 guns by the end of the action. Granted, that was close to 2 hours of firing, so people got tired, things heated up and expanded and didn't work right anymore. There were mechanical failures. But again, this is a much higher degree than were experienced by, say, Rodney, which also had teething issues with her 16-inch guns when she was new built. Duke of York, which was the 3rd ship to enter service and also the 3rd ship to engage German battleships, in December of 43, caught the German battleship Scharnhorst. And during her combat, which granted happened in really bad weather at night, had less than 70% of her ordered shots actually able to fire. So again, this is a ship that has worked up, has been in the war for at least 2 years, has done training, and they're still experiencing significantly higher rates of failures than should be expected. Again, the complexity of the quadruple gun turret was probably to blame for a fair percentage of that, although a certain percentage of failures are normal and expected. So, service lives, the ships had the major engagements I just described. The rest of the time, they were escorting convoys across the North Atlantic, protecting them against German battleships. Duke of York was supporting a convoy when Scharnhorst sortied, and she was able to catch her. King George V and Prince of Wales were both directly dispatched to hunt for Bismarck. But the rest of the time, they were escorting convoys, wearing out their engines. They were doing naval gunfire support in the Mediterranean when the United States and Great Britain started to invade North Africa and Italy. Some of them were transferred to the Pacific by the end of the war and conducted shore bombardments and escorted carriers there. And at least 3 of these ships were in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered. And at least 2 of them were in Hong Kong when the Japanese surrendered there too. And so these ships had a rather active career. And after World War II, as the United Kingdom tried to save money, all 4 surviving ships were decommissioned and mothballed. And by 1958 or 1959, they'd all been sold for scrap and cut up within a year of that. It would have been great for one of these ships to be saved as a museum, but again, that was pretty early in the concept of preserving museum ships, and it would have been real expensive. So, in summation, these ships are pretty middle of the pack when it comes to the treaty battleships. They have maybe the best armor of any of the treaty battleships. They have the weakest gun battery and the most failures, and they've got pretty middle of the pack speed and a good anti-aircraft battery for a European ship, but not good when you compare it to an American battleship. Compared to the Iowas, again, which have almost a quarter more displacement, they're significantly slower, potentially better armored, but significantly less well armed. They proved to be a really good investment for the Royal Navy, who otherwise would not have had fast, modern battleships in World War II. And these ships saw a tremendous amount of service and were pretty well worn out by the end of the war. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments about the King George V or other ships you would like to see us do in future comparison videos, drop them in the comment section down below. If you like what you see and you would like to support the museum and our YouTube channel in particular, check the description below for a link to our GoFundMe campaign. Anything you donate there comes back into the channel so we can keep producing these videos. We do also receive support from the New Jersey Department of State. Also, remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we put out new content. We do try to put out several new videos a week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.